There is a phrase people return to without noticing they are returning. Tomorrow, later. When things settle, it sounds harmless, almost considerate, as if patience were being practiced. But beneath the softness, something else is moving. Not urgency, not pressure, avoidance. It rarely announces itself as fear. It prefers a calmer entrance, a reasonable tone, a measured delay. The mind presents it as thoughtfulness, as timing, as realism, and so it passes unquestioned. You hear it in your own voice sometimes. Not loud, not dramatic, just certain. You tell yourself you are waiting for clarity, for confidence, for a better version of yourself to arrive, but that version never does. Because the waiting is not neutral, it is an action, a quiet one. Carl Jung observed that what remains unconscious does not stay inactive. It simply governs from below awareness. Fear works the same way. When it is unnamed, it becomes fluent. It learns your vocabulary. It borrows your logic. It does not say stop. It says not yet, and you listen because it sounds like you. There is a moment, small, easy to miss, when you feel the tension between what you know and what you do. It shows up as a slight heaviness, a pause that lingers longer than necessary. You sense that something wants to move forward, and something else tightens to keep it still. Most people call this hesitation, but hesitation is already a conclusion. Before it, there was recognition, a brief internal alignment where you knew, not intellectually, viscerally, this matters, this is yours to do. And then the language begins. Reasons form, conditions appear, explanations arrive fully dressed. They are convincing because they are familiar. I don't have enough time. I need to be more prepared. It wouldn't work right now. None of them are lies. That is what makes them effective. They are partial truths used as shelter. Jung understood that the psyche builds defenses not to deceive the world, but to protect the self from exposure. Excuses are one of its most elegant structures. They allow you to remain intact, unchallenged, unrevealed. They keep the image of competence untouched. It is easier to delay than to discover where you stand. Because trying would mean finding out, and finding out would mean relinquishing control. So the mind negotiates. It promises action in exchange for safety, progress in exchange for comfort. Later becomes a contract. And life waits because it has no choice. Over time, the delay hardens into identity. You become someone who almost began, who nearly changed, who understood deeply but acted cautiously. The cage forms slowly enough that it feels like structure. You call it responsibility. You call it prudence. You call it being realistic. But underneath the naming, something quiet presses outward. A sense of compression, a subtle grief without an object. Not sadness, recognition that you are living adjacent to yourself. Jung spoke of awakening not as an acquisition, but as a turning inward, a shift of attention from the external narrative to the internal movement. Fear resists this turn because when you look inward honestly, fear loses its anonymity. It cannot hide behind circumstances. It cannot outsource responsibility. It has to be seen. And being seen changes its function. Fear does not disappear when noticed, but it stops directing traffic. It becomes sensation instead of command. You begin to notice how often logic arrives after emotion, how reasons trail impulses like justification rather than cause. You see how the mind assembles coherence to defend stillness. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There is a specific discomfort that comes with this awareness. Not panic, not urgency, a quiet unease. Because now the excuse feels thin, transparent. You still say it, but it no longer lands the same way. Something in you knows. This is the mirror moment. Not dramatic, not loud, just unmistakable. You catch yourself mid-explanation and recognize the tone, the careful phrasing, the softening of truth. You realize the obstacle is not time or readiness or resources. It is exposure. Fear of discovering your own limits. Fear of discovering your own capacity. Both feel equally dangerous. So the psyche chooses stasis, because stasis preserves ambiguity. If you never fully try, you never fully fail, and you never fully succeed. The illusion of potential remains intact. Jung warned that unlived life does not disappear. It accumulates. It shows up as restlessness, as irritability, as a quiet contempt for circumstances that mirror your own restraint. You begin to feel trapped by conditions you once accepted willingly, and still the excuses continue. Because they have worked before, they have kept you safe, they have kept you whole. But safety and wholeness are not the same. Safety avoids disruption. Wholeness integrates it. Fear is not opposed to survival, it is devoted to it. But survival extended too long becomes confinement. And the body knows this before the mind admits it. You feel it in the way energy dulls, in the way motivation no longer responds to reassurance, in the way encouragement feels irritating rather than inspiring. Because the problem is not lack of motivation, it is misalignment. Something essential is being postponed, and postponement has a cost. Not dramatic at first, cumulative. Days blend. Opportunities lose edges. You adjust to the distance between intention and action until it feels normal. This is how people sleep while awake. Not unconscious, unaware. Jung believed awakening begins the moment inner conflict is no longer anesthetized by explanation. When you stop narrating your delay and start noticing it. The noticing is uncomfortable, but it is precise. It reveals how fear translates itself into reasonable language, how it convinces you to wait for a future version of yourself that can never arrive without movement. And something subtle shifts, not resolve, not confidence, clarity. You see that readiness has always been a consequence, not a prerequisite. That action was never meant to follow certainty. Certainty follows action. This realization does not push you forward. It removes the illusion that was holding you back. The excuse no longer protects. It simply delays. And delay begins to feel heavier than risk. The inner negotiation grows quieter, shorter. Fear still speaks, but it is no longer fluent. You begin to sense that what you have been calling reasons were actually translations. Fear speaking in your voice. And once you hear that clearly, the language starts to lose its authority. Not because you are brave, but because you are awake. The awakening does not announce itself, it settles. And from that stillness, something prepares to move. Not forcefully, not dramatically, but inevitably. Not yet acted upon, but no longer negotiable. Something has been seen, and what has been seen will not return to sleep. There is a strange relief in having an excuse ready. It smooths the edge of dissatisfaction. It gives shape to unease. It allows you to remain still without feeling inert. The mind rests against it like a familiar surface. I'll do it when things are calmer. I need more time to think. I don't want to rush. Nothing about these phrases feels dishonest. That is their strength. They carry a tone of care, of responsibility. They suggest maturity. And yet, beneath them, something tightens. Not urgency, not anxiety, compression. Jung wrote about the shadow as what is pushed aside, not because it is evil, but because it is inconvenient to the image we maintain. Excuses belong there. They are not mistakes. They are protections. They keep you from having to confront the parts of yourself that are unfinished, uncertain, or untested. They preserve coherence. You remain someone who could act, who will act, just not now. There is comfort in that suspension, because as long as action is postponed, identity stays fluid. Nothing has to be proven. Nothing has to be risked. The psyche prefers this state. It allows desire without exposure, intention without consequence. You can imagine progress without encountering resistance. This is why the excuse feels gentle. It does not demand confrontation. It soothes. It says, rest here, stay intact. But rest is not always restoration. Sometimes it is avoidance made comfortable. You notice this when the same reasons repeat themselves across years. When the circumstances change, but the conclusion does not. Different context, same delay. The mind adapts quickly. It learns how to justify stillness under any condition. Jung observed that when awareness does not develop, patterns harden. What begins as a choice becomes a habit. What becomes a habit becomes character. The excuse slips quietly into routine. You stop questioning it. You stop hearing its tone. It becomes the background voice that narrates your life. And the longer it remains unquestioned, the more convincing it becomes. There is a particular kind of fatigue that arises from this. Not the fatigue of effort, the fatigue of restraint. Holding yourself back requires energy. Suppressing impulse requires vigilance. You feel it as dullness, as irritability without direction, as a loss of appetite for things that once mattered. The psyche knows when it is being contained unnecessarily. It begins to leak through distraction, through resentment, through a quiet sense of envy toward people who act imperfectly but move forward anyway. The excuse promises safety, but it creates friction because something essential is being deferred. Jung spoke of individuation as a movement toward wholeness, not comfort. Wholeness demands participation. It requires you to engage with what frightens you, not because it is safe, but because it is yours. Excuses interrupt this process. They keep you oriented toward the external, conditions, timing, approval, rather than the internal directive that has already formed. You begin to live reactively, waiting for the world to align before you do. But the world does not organize itself around readiness. It responds to movement. Stillness without awareness becomes stagnation, and stagnation feels different from rest. It has a weight. You feel it in the way days lose distinction, in the way anticipation dulls. The excuse that once felt protective begins to feel repetitive, predictable. You hear yourself say the words and feel their hollowness even as you speak them. This is not guilt, it is recognition. The psyche registering incongruence. Jung believed that what we do not confront appears in our lives as fate. Patterns repeat until they are acknowledged. Excuses are one such pattern. They cycle until you notice their function, until you see that they are not neutral explanations, but strategies. Strategies to avoid vulnerability. Because action exposes you to outcome. It reveals your limits, your competence, your endurance. It collapses fantasy into fact, and fact cannot be negotiated with. This is why perfection becomes such a convincing refuge. If conditions are never ideal, action can always be postponed. Preparation becomes infinite. The mind convinces itself it is progressing while remaining unchanged. But something subtle shifts when you observe this honestly, without judgment, without drama. You notice how often thinking about it replaces engagement, how often reflection becomes delay. The insight does not push you forward. It simply removes the illusion that you are moving when you are not. This is unsettling because it returns responsibility to where it belongs. Inside, Jung emphasized that consciousness is not comfortable. It disturbs the arrangement that kept things manageable. Once you see the pattern, the excuse loses some of its ease. It still appears, but it no longer reassures. It feels rehearsed. You begin to sense that the comfort it offers is temporary and the cost is cumulative. Time passes either way. The difference is whether you are present for it. Avoidance does not stop life from unfolding. It only ensures you are not fully participating. And participation, though risky, is enlivening. You can feel the difference in the body. Avoidance contracts, engagement expands. Even when fear is present, especially then, there is a moment when this awareness settles deeply enough that the excuse no longer feels like protection. It feels like distance, distance from your own agency, and distance becomes intolerable. Not urgently, gradually. The inner narrative shortens. You stop explaining so much. Silence replaces justification, and in that silence, something steadies. Not confidence, not certainty. Readiness of a different kind. The readiness that comes from no longer pretending. You are not fearless. You are simply no longer anesthetized. Fear is still there, but it is no longer in charge of language. It no longer gets to decide when you move by deciding how you speak. This is where the comfort of the excuse begins to dissolve. Not because you reject it, but because you no longer need it. And what remains is unfamiliar, open, unscripted. Something is forming beneath the surface. Not yet action, but no longer delay. Something that does not require permission. Something that is waiting for the smallest movement to begin. There comes a point when the silence changes texture. It is no longer restful. It no longer feels like patience. It feels weighted. Not with fear exactly, with awareness. You notice that the space between intention and action has become too familiar, that you can predict your own delays with unsettling accuracy. The same internal sequence, the same soft reasoning, the same conclusion. Nothing dramatic happens, but something settles. A realization that does not rush. You see that the excuse is no longer protecting you from danger. It is protecting you from contact. Contact with uncertainty, with effort, with the version of yourself that only exists in motion. Jung believed that awakening begins when a person stops identifying with the persona that keeps life manageable and starts noticing the inner movement that has been ignored. This moment feels like that, not a decision, a shift in orientation. You stop asking whether fear is justified. You stop negotiating with it. You simply see it. Fear becomes sensation rather than narrative, tightness rather than explanation. And without the explanation, it loses leverage. You are not suddenly brave. You are precise. You recognize that fear has been speaking on your behalf for a long time, choosing language, setting terms. It has told you when to wait, when to prepare, when to step back. And you believed it because it sounded careful. Now the care feels excessive. The cost becomes visible, not in catastrophe, in erosion. Energy spent maintaining distance, attention spent justifying stillness. You begin to feel how much effort has gone into not moving. This is the turning. Jung wrote that what we avoid most persistently is often what carries the greatest potential for integration, not because it is pleasant, but because it is formative. You begin to sense that the thing you have been postponing is not an outcome. It is a confrontation with yourself, with limits, with capacity, with responsibility. Responsibility feels heavy until it is claimed. Then it becomes stabilizing. The excuses fall quieter now. They still appear, but without conviction. They sound like echoes rather than directives. You notice that you no longer need to argue with them. You simply let them pass. This creates space and not excitement, not certainty, room. And in that room, something subtle emerges. A steadiness that does not depend on reassurance, a clarity that does not require confidence. You begin to understand that fear was never asking to be eliminated. It was asking to be acknowledged and then surpassed. Not forcefully, not heroically, by presence. You feel the difference between waiting and choosing, between postponement and pause. A pause is alive. It contains direction. Postponement is inert. You have mistaken one for the other for a long time. Now the distinction is clear. This clarity does not rush you into action. It aligns you with it. When movement comes, it will feel quieter than expected, less dramatic, more exact. Jung suggested that consciousness expands not through grand moments, but through repeated acts of honest recognition. This is one of them. You recognize that no further explanation is needed, that you understand enough, that waiting has lost its justification. And in that recognition, a single word surfaces. Not spoken, felt, enough. Not as frustration, as alignment. Enough delay, enough translation, enough distance. The word does not demand action. It removes obstruction. What follows is not urgency. It is inevitability. The sense that something will move because it can no longer remain still without distortion. You do not feel resolved. You feel oriented. Fear still exists. Uncertainty still accompanies you. But they no longer define the boundary of your life. They have become part of the terrain rather than the gate. You stand closer to yourself now. Not triumphant, not transformed, present. And presence changes everything quietly. The future does not open dramatically. It clarifies. You see the next step not because it is safe, but because it is visible. And visibility is enough for now.